Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Duncan Williams, the director of the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. And on behalf of the USC Ito Center and our partner organizations, Densho, the Japanese American National Museum, and Tsuru for Solidarity, I'd like to welcome you to the first public event of the Black and Japanese American Reparations series, an event and book club series that aims to bring together anyone interested in a conversation about the deeper meaning of repairing our nation's racial karma. In the Japanese cultural tradition, today, February 3rd in most years, although this year it's actually February 2nd, we celebrate the festival of Setsubun, the day when winter turns into spring, a change not only of the season, but in the older lunar calendar of Japan, a shift of the year where we ritually cleanse out any bad fortunes and energies of the previous year to usher in a fresh new beginning. And in the Buddhist tradition that I'm a part of, we say that in fact, every moment exists as a fresh new moment to renew ourselves. But in life, we know that despite these opportunities for renewal, we cannot but be contending with the deep forces of karma, the ways in which the past interlinks with the present. And America's racial karma is a deep and enduring one that oscillates between a vision of a nation that is essentially defined as white and Christian, and a broader vision of a nation that is multi-ethnic in character, religiously plural and free. And so in this season of February, of Setsubun in the Japanese tradition, during Black History Month, we are reminded of America's racial karma that needs to be reckoned with, engaged, and healed. And so we have this program of educating ourselves. Also during this season, when in February, the Japanese American community commemorates what are called Days of Remembrance, an occasion to recall the February 19th, 1942 Presidential Executive Order 9066 that led to the forced removal, indefinite incarceration, and family separation that marked that community's experience during World War II. It's an opportunity to also think about the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, the Redress bill, that was the culmination of the efforts of so many people in the Japanese American community, but also people in the Black Congressional Caucus, people like Ron Dellums, who recalled in his testimony in support of Japanese American reparations, his own experience as a 6-year-old in Oakland, when he saw his friend Roland being taken away in a truck just because he was Japanese American. And he said, vote for this bill and remember the tears in the eyes of his friend Roland. And so it took a multi-ethnic campaign and an effort to pass that initial start to repair the racial trauma of the Japanese American World War II experience. And it's going to take a multi-ethnic effort to address this much deeper karmic legacy of American life that has to do with Black reparations. So in this season, it's with great appreciation that we invite the authors of this book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, the folklorist A. Kirsten Mullen, and Distinguished Professor of Economics at Duke University, William Darity, to this conversation, one which will be in conversation with the author of this book, also a 2020 recent publication, Redress, the inside story of the successful campaign for Japanese American reparations by John Tateishi, a leader back then in the Japanese American Citizens League, for the legislative campaign to pass that reparations bill. And so today's conversation will be moderated by my friend and wonderful colleague here at USC, Susan Kamei. She teaches our course on the World War II Japanese American incarceration experience. And she will be moderating this conversation between three amazing people and authors who in recent times have drawn on their decades of experience on this question of reparations. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Susan Kamei.
Thank you so much, Duncan. And thank you for setting the stage with such thoughtful messages for us. And welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you join us. And I think we're all in for a real treat and also a real education. We'll have this conversation with our distinguished authors for the first hour or so. And then in the last 30 minutes, we'll be delighted to have questions from you as the audience. And we invite you to put your questions into the chat at any point, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And if our book club launch is any indication, there will be so much to talk about that we can't promise that we'll be able to get to every question, but we'll do our best to cover as much of the waterfront as possible. And so it's really my delight to get to moderate this conversation. And let's set the stage a bit, if we can, to talk with John and Kirsten and Sandy about their respective books. So John, may we start with you? It was very meaningful for me to read your book. As a Redress volunteer, it was reliving history, but it was also amazing to me to read what was going on behind the scenes. And you also bring really a lifetime of connection with the issue, being a child incarcerated at Manzanar with your family, your origins with the Redress campaign go back to the 1970s. And then you mentioned in the book that you wrote the first draft in 2007. So let's maybe start with your motivations for producing the book at this point, and what's it like to put it out there in today's political and social environment?
Thanks, Susan. First of all, let me just say that I appreciate your inviting me to participate in this. It's a real honor to be on a program or to have a discussion with Kirsten and Sandy, who are such distinguished authors. To answer your question, as you pointed out, I wrote the original manuscript in 2007 at the bidding of Senator Daniel Inouye, who kept bugging me about recording the history of the campaign, since it was such a unique and unexpected campaign. No one thought we had a chance. No one thought reparations would ever be possible in this country. And so I wrote what was essentially a very detailed, very complete description of what happened in the campaign, but it hung a lot of our dirty laundry out. And it was later that I started thinking about rewriting that manuscript to try to turn it into a manuscript that I could give to a publisher for publication. And in 2019, I had occasion to meet Steve Wasserman, who is the publisher of Heyday Books. And he was very interested. And so what you see is the result of that original manuscript. I decided I would try to get it published because I realized in the process of writing it that it was really a pretty unique story. It was something that, as I read through the manuscript I'd written, the original one, there were so many parts to this, so many pieces that had to come together. And, a lot of it was luck. A lot of it was the brilliance of 4 Japanese American members of Congress who helped guide this effort. And I realized that this was a really unique campaign that survived the tough roads of politics, but was able to succeed only because certain things came together.
Mhm.
And so that's the result of the book.
Thank you for doing it. Kirsten and Sandy, you both likewise have very personal connections to the book topic. And I love your book dedication that shares the names of your family members, your ancestors who were born enslaved and lived to see emancipation. For us as readers, I think it was a wonderful opportunity to acknowledge those individuals with you and demonstrate for others that they could research their family histories too. How did the social climate affect the reception of your book when it came out 8 months ago?
Go ahead.
I want to say first, we are so grateful to be part of this conversation, and just would like to offer thanks so much to you, Susan, and to Duncan and to John for inviting us and for, just helping us to think about these questions in a very serious way. We wanted very much to honor our ancestors. I think so much about all the questions I would have asked my forebears if I had thought to do so, after they had passed. I've learned so much about their lives through archives, and it would have been so amazing, to have had a chance to talk to them about their understanding of, what slavery meant to our family, for example. We wanted very much, to suggest to individuals who will say, well, slavery is such a long time ago that at least in my family, that's not the case.
Right.
My mother's mother's father, so my great-grandfather, was born enslaved. And my grandmother just passed a few years ago. Both my children, knew her for many, many years. And so, part of the reason for the dedication was to, to say their names, to put them in print, and to suggest to others that they could find joy in this research themselves, but also to make clear, to make concrete this connection that we had to this before and after. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In my family, the generational connection is spaced a little further than Kirsten's, because Kirsten is the third generation born out of slavery. And on one side of my family, I'm the fourth generation born out of slavery. My great-grandmother, who I knew personally before she died, was the daughter of Robert Body and Lucy Mitchell, who were two individuals who were enslaved on Rose Hill Plantation in North Carolina. So there is a deep personal connection to the history of enslavement in the United States that's quite explicit in our families. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that we wrote the book with that in the front of our minds. I think we wrote the book not because exclusively of the history of slavery in the United States, but because of the consequences of the events that took place after slavery ended, including, and perhaps most significantly, the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised as restitution, which has had ramifications for the resources and the opportunities that exist for Black Americans today. So it's really the current circumstances of Black Americans who are descendants of US slavery that really motivated us to write the book. But there is an inspiration that we've received from our ancestors.
I mean, you asked us, I'm sorry, you asked us about, what it's like to have the book be published, in this environment where we find ourselves. And that's been head spinning, in a lot of ways. I think about how in January 2019, Marianne Williamson was then a candidate for, presidency, first advocated, spoke up and said she supported a program of reparations. Now, what she thinks of, what her conception is somewhat different, significantly different from ours, but she was willing to talk about it and to say that it would require direct payments to eligible recipients. And then not long after that, Julian Castro and Tom Steyer both indicated they too supported some kind of program to redistribute wealth in this country. And then candidate Biden indicated that he would be interested potentially in a reparations program if it were tied to a program for Native Americans. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what comes of that. I would say it's not just what these politicians say, but what the American people insist that they do. So we need to be watchful of what's happening. But when January 2019 rolled around, news reporters were looking for someone who could talk about reparations. And I think by that time there had already been some pre-publicity for our book, From Here to Equality. And so in some circles, we were it. And so we began this journey of talking to folks in the news media, writing op-eds long before the book was published. I mean, the book was only published 9 months ago, but it feels like it's been
A lifetime.
People sometimes confuse our book with the novel From Here to Eternity. So the term eternity comes to mind.
Yeah, but then you add COVID, and then you add the horrible tragedies of the deaths of unarmed Black people over the summer, and you have this cataclysmic confluence of events that brought the conversation to a lot of people's lips.
Very much a cauldron, hasn't it been? So you mentioned eligibility. So how about we dive right in on that? John, in your book, you talk about the legislative battlefield and how it's all about compromise, the idea of giving up on some goals in order to end up with something as opposed to ending up with nothing. I know there were many key compromises that went into what we know of as the Redress Bill, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and 1988, and especially regarding eligibility provisions. You want to tackle that?
One of the really difficult decisions we had to make was, as I was lobbying this bill to establish a commission, and the commission, that bill was actually pretty benign. All it did was ask for an investigation of the circumstances that led to the issuance of Executive Order 9066, the order that ultimately resulted in our removal and imprisonment. And it only asked for $3 million to operate. And the whole premise of redress, Japanese American redress, was based around the violation of constitutional rights. And so I was lobbying this bill through the Congress, and I'd always run into, keep in mind, most members of Congress, just the few were not attorneys. Members of Congress were, in general, people who had gone through law school, who had served mostly as prosecutors. And so they knew the law. They knew about Korematsu. They knew the history of the legal side of this whole issue. And so I'd run into Republicans who would say, well, there were those who were not American citizens. And they were referring then to the Issei, the immigrants who came here and by federal statute could not become American citizens. After this bill was starting to gain a lot of momentum, I ran into a different issue where someone said that to me. Again, this is a Republican. And I explained about the Issei situation, and he said, no, I'm talking about non-citizens. There were people who were not American citizens who were brought to this country and were in those camps, and you want us to give them reparations? And I knew they were talking about Japanese Latin Americans. It became this really difficult issue because that became the blocking point on the bill. Keep in mind, on any piece of legislation, any legislators who don't like it are going to look for the nitpicks of it, look for those little things that are going to create a problem. And then if you have big issues like this one, it creates a roadblock on the bill. And so we had to make a decision what to do about that particular issue. And, I met with the 4 Japanese American members of Congress, and I was representing the JACL view. And we decided that we had to take the Japanese Latin Americans out of that bill in order to make it viable as a proposition to get through the Congress. And basically what we did that on was by designating eligibility limited to those who were American citizens, those who were living in the military zone at the time the executive order was signed, which meant California, Oregon, Washington, the western half of Arizona. This was one of those decisions where, it had to be made, and it was based on the old cliche of for the greater good. Do we jeopardize a bill that would affect the lives of 80,000 Japanese Americans based on this one issue? Or do we take that out and come back to it? Which was what we decided. And it was a tough decision. It was one that we still, in a sense, we still pay a price for it, because that issue never got resolved satisfactorily. But it was necessary in order to provide redress for Japanese Americans. And, as I said, there were 80,000 of us. And so there are trade-offs you have to make constantly in trying to get a bill through. And part of it is you eliminate the things that are going to kill it. And that was, everyone recognized, everyone involved in that legislation, that would potentially kill the bill. So, that's probably the hardest exchange we made, the hardest deal we had to cut. But, ultimately it proved to be the right decision.
What about also the decision that it would be only to then alive former incarcerees, as opposed to descendants of those who had already passed away?
As I was lobbying that, I realized this was the can of worm issue, because there were a few members who were quite honest about it, and they're from the South, and they said to me, if we give your people reparations, what are we going to do when the blacks come after you're done? And we can't afford it. And it was something that made a lot of members of the Congress nervous, because if we were to succeed with our effort, and there were only 120,000 of us in 1942, and at that time we estimated maybe between 60 and 80,000. So the numbers were limited. But if you looked at the Black population, it was huge. There was no way to reconcile the numbers. And so the argument was, basically it was the fear that if we succeeded, and so we tried to do this as a door that would open a consideration, but not that it would open up Black reparations as an issue. And it wasn't something that affected any decisions we were making, because we had our fight to fight, and we were going to see how far we could go with it. And but I knew this was always there in the minds of members of Congress. And we talk about eligibility. It's a very complex issue with, Sandy and Kirsten talk about this in the book. And I know there are different groups who define eligibility in different ways when it comes to Black reparations. Compared to that issue, ours was almost, I'm inclined to say it was almost like a piece of cake, because we could define everything so much more clearly. And our numbers were smaller. And that makes a huge difference, because, I'll let them talk about what that's going to entail.
Okay, back to you, Kirsten and Sandy. And so how do you address that question about redress having gone only to the surviving incarcerees, and therefore isn't a precedent for Black reparations to descendants of enslaved persons?
Yeah, so first of all, I think as a matter of principle, reparations should have gone to the descendants of the survivors of the Japanese unjust incarceration. But insofar as they didn't, insofar as the restitution went to the direct victims, we view living Black Americans as direct victims of the full trajectory of America's racial history. And that full trajectory is one in which we have to include not only slavery, but we also have to incorporate nearly 100 years of legal segregation in the United States, coupled with wave upon wave of massacres that took place in a number of cities and towns throughout the country, east and west, north and south, where Black lives were lost, where Black property was either destroyed or it was appropriated by the white terrorists. This took place between the end of the Civil War up until the 1940s. And also, we have to include on the Bill of Particulars events that took place after the passage of the Civil Rights legislation of 1964, which includes mass incarceration. It includes ongoing police executions of unarmed Blacks. It includes discrimination in housing, credit, and employment markets. And it must include, most significantly, the enormous racial wealth gap in the United States, which amounts essentially to about $850,000 per Black versus white household in terms of net worth. Or in a related vein, Black Americans who are descendants of US slavery constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And from our standpoint, that inequality or disparity is a consequence of the cumulative intergenerational effects of racism in the United States. So the harms are being visited directly upon living descendants of the persons who were enslaved. And of course, since we're taking into account atrocities that have occurred since slavery ended, we are talking about eligible recipients who should be compensated, who've been directly harmed in the United States. Yeah.
That's absolutely the case. We hear often this term slave reparations. And I think part of why that term is invoked so often is that we want these problems to be in the past. We don't want to think about the fact that we still have, segregation. We still have, discrimination across every sector. We don't want to. We want to say that we're past all that. That we're better than that. We can be better than that, but we have to earn it first. Mm-hmm. And that is part of what our mission is. I mean, one of the reasons that we wrote From Here to Equality was to kind of broaden this conversation, first of all, and to point to significant areas of our history, distant history and our recent history, that have not really been talked about very much. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, parts of our history that have been actively masked, yes, or disguised. I coined the term dismemory to describe the sort of active, systematic efforts on behalf of some individuals, but also some organizations, to distort our history and to confuse us about what actually happened in the past. Scholars like Jacqueline Dowd Hall have revealed through her archival research the work of groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the American Daughters of the Revolution, who got involved in the textbook writing business. Not only did they identify and celebrate and push, authors who were more inclined to glorify the institution of slavery and to talk about it as this civilizing institution that was the best thing that ever happened to these African people, that this was their life's goal, to be enslaved, that talked about the lost cause, but that, sort of de-emphasize slavery as the reason why the Civil War was fought, and also to push Reconstruction off the table in terms of conversation. Here was this really exciting moment when you had Blacks and whites co-governing, Black men and white men co-governing harmoniously in many different cities across the country, not just in the South. But many people were not content to see that happening. But we don't even talk about that as a period where, the country was headed in the right direction. We don't break down, what were the basic tenets of Reconstruction and talk about how we can revive that same kind of sentiment. But yes, this is a big part of the work that we think needs to happen is, both to look at the primary documents so that all of us can see what actually was happening, but also be aware of the interventions that were made to whitewash, our thinking about what was going on with the North and South, these lost cause proponents.
Well, I think,
John,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, John made a very important point in terms of the magnitude of the restitution that's involved when we start talking about reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Because unlike approximately 80,000 people being deserving of reparative justice, in the context of thinking about the Black American population that's descended from persons who were enslaved in the United States, that's about 40 million people today. And if the total bill was intended to eliminate the racial wealth gap in the United States, that would amount to at least, at minimum, an expenditure somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 trillion dollars. Now, I think that there's some disingenuity on the part of any individuals in Congress who say, well, the issue with Black Americans is it's just too expensive to do it, particularly in light of the huge overnight expenditures that have been made during the course of the Great Recession, but also most recently in response to the pandemic itself. It's fairly clear that the United States government has a great capacity to fund programs that are of high expense. So if we embrace the principle that reparations for Black Americans are justified, just as reparations for Japanese Americans were wholly justified, then the next question is, when are we actually going to do it?
And part of the problem that I see between Japanese American redress and Black reparations is that ours was a very defined moment in history where our constitutional rights were abused and we were put into prisons. We came out of the war and found our way back into American society. However, we were able to do that. What you're talking about, when you talk about Black reparations, you have to look, and you talk about this in your book, about the wealth gap between white America and Black America. That's the result of that history. And so it's ours had a cutoff point. Yours does. I mean, when you talk about Black reparations, it starts with slaves and continues to this day. And the Black community continues to suffer because of that whole history. And it's, people talk about racism as systemic. It is in a very real sense because it's part of American society. And the amount may be in the trillions, but it seems to me that's not a lot of money compared to the disaster in the future if we don't do something about this. So, the amount of money is important, obviously, but if you look at the past 4 years and the amount of money wasted, it seems to me the Treasury has the ability to do this. And, my feeling is, how can we afford not to rectify this issue, this problem.
The great American scholar, historian, and orator Frederick Douglass spoke to this very question, and he said, there's no amount of money that could make these could make up for, all of these, years and years, centuries of enslavement. But he said that is no reason not to do it. It's really important for symbolic and substantive reasons to pay reparations to these individuals. John, you said something else that really struck me. You talked about Japanese Americans returning to the lives that they had been able to create. But in the case of the newly emancipated enslaved people, they hadn't had this period of freedom. They hadn't had this period of being full citizens or even partial citizens to return to. And so that's what we're talking about still. We're still, trying to arrive at this moment when Black American descendants of U.S. slavery have attained full citizenship. That has yet to happen.
So one of the comments that I remember from my Redress days was, in addition to the legislative strategies, and there were judicial avenues that were pursued, also the reopening of the Supreme Court cases and criminal convictions for Fred Korematsu and Gordon Hirabayashi and Yasui with the Quorum Nobis efforts. But one of the phrases that we used a lot was that we were also trying the matter in the court, not just in courts of law or in the halls of Congress, but also in the court of public opinion. And it seems to me that in order to get to these moments, Kirsten and Sandy, where there is that recognition, is that this is a great education effort. Certainly, my reading of your book, every paragraph was a eye-opening education. So I think what we share in the two campaigns, if we can call them that, is this continual quest, this continual importance on greater understanding in the public.
Yes.
John, the redress effort started out with different groups having different strategies. I remember those days, and the infighting and the considerations among the strategies was pretty fierce, was pretty brutal. And you mentioned, especially when JSCL decided to put the support behind the commission approach. From your perspective, did we in the Japanese American community, do we ever achieve a unity of purpose? And is it possible for a community to arise above its differences in presenting a united front?
I think anytime you have a campaign like this that is community-based and driven by the community, you're going to get those differences. There'll be different groups, different spokespeople who will advocate different things, and even those who will warn against doing it because it would seem dishonorable. I mean, in our case, certainly, that this was dishonorable. This was anathema to being Japanese Americans. But the groups had very strong, very passionate differences. And we fought with each other pretty much through the first half of the campaign, or first 3/4 of the campaign, with those differences. It was only when the commission was functioning and came into the communities, and it was designed to hear from Japanese American witnesses from the Nisei primarily, and set up a schedule for Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago for public hearings. That was the moment at which the differences started to not disappear, but the edges got softer. And we started working together. The JSL was spearheading this effort, but quite honestly, there were other groups. Like one of the strongest critics of the JSL was a group called NCRR, National Council for Redress Reparations, who were really great at working with the community to prepare for these hearings. In fact, much more adept at that than the JSL was. I mean, they really were able to help the community a lot. And I think that brought us together. It unified the community more. And once the commission finished its work, came out with this report, and then the recommendations, and then a bill was submitted, introduced, which was a money bill. At that point, there was no other option. It had to be that bill or nothing. And there were still some other attempts at legislation, but those fell by the wayside. It was that one bill, which became public law, I've lost can't think of the title. Anyway, that was the redress bill that was signed in 1988. And that became the only thing to fight for. And that's when the community finally unified to try to support that and get that through. And I think in some ways that was really important to deal with the differences and finally come to some resolution that there was a bill that everybody could support. And that's what finally unified the community on that effort. There were other things we continued to fight about, but you know, that's the community.
John, was there a threshold set of characteristics the bill had to have for you all to support it? Could there have been a piece of legislation that was brought forward that would have been unacceptable?
The bill that finally unified the community was had a figure, $20,000 figure. The JSL had a position of $25,000. That was our guideline that we were going to try to fight for. We did not include an apology because at that point, the feeling was an apology would be too easy. Given the choice, the Congress would choose an apology over money. Our demand was for compensation. What became a difficult decision for all of us was that figure. Was $25,000 adequate? There were other groups that said we had to have more, and others who said we would be satisfied with less. But because this is a first-time effort, we had never ventured into this arena before. The fact that we had so much cohesion behind this one effort of the commission, once it got to a certain point, a lot of the resistance to what that commission was all about fell to the wayside. But quite honestly, the commission concept was not popular, not even within the JSL. That's the one that would have been rejected. But because the organization's policy was for this commission, and because the 4 Japanese American members of Congress supported this one particular approach, all the other efforts at legislation really didn't stand much of a chance. And this was the only way we were going to drive the issue. But you know, if given different bills, none of us liked the commission idea. We thought this is going to waste time. It wouldn't result in anything. But the strategy was designed to work, and it did work. And I think if we all had a choice of maybe 4 or 5 different options on legislation, none of us would have chosen the commission strategy because it seemed too soft. It seemed taking an easy way around the hard issue of money. But it was what allowed us to get to that point of demanding reparations, monetary compensation. You know, you face difficult choices in trying to sort legislation out. And you just have to kind of figure out where you're headed and how you're going to get there, and the vehicles that are going to get you there. There was a lawsuit filed against the government during the Redress campaign, and it sought a huge amount of money, I think it was $210,000 per person. And that case was not successful. It got to a hearing, but never really advanced beyond that. And all of our effort was on legislation. And I dare say you're probably going to see maybe 2 or 3 different bills in the Black reparations effort. And I'm not sure what it is that makes one succeed and the other not be able to find its way within that movement, because it's such a diverse movement right now.
So Kirsten, Sandy, we've got HR 40 and a commission approach for Black reparations on the table. What do you think?
So we do want to talk about HR 40, but I did want to say, one of the things that was really striking to me and impressive was the way that JSL, pushed these issues and these conversations out through the individual chapters, so that they would have an opportunity to discuss the pros and cons and to give some thought community by community. The Black redress movement doesn't have that structure, and I think it's accurate to say that there is not this unification yet. We're not there yet. There are a number of different groups with different points of view that are vying, for ascendancy. And we keep saying, it's really imperative, that we have, that we can come to terms at least on the basics, the basic principles of what it is we're talking about. And as you said, to work out the rough edges a bit later. But we're still waiting to get to the point where there is general agreement, across different groups, grassroots groups, formal groups, about what it is we're seeking and for whom.
I think at the present moment, it's still the case that about somewhere in the vicinity of 30% of Black Americans are actually against reparations. So it's not exclusively a question of what type of reparations. It's also a question of whether or not you're in favor of Black American reparations in the first place. But I wanted to comment a bit on HR 40, which is the legislation that has been in Congress for approximately 30 years, not always under that number or label, but has been in Congress for about 30 years to form a commission that would study reparations and ultimately provide proposals to Congress for reparations. We think that, well, we don't have a great deal of confidence that the commission that would be produced by the legislation as it's currently worded would generate the type of reparations plan that would meet the task of addressing the specificity of eligibility of Black Americans who are descendants of US slavery, nor would it meet the task of reaching the goal of eliminating the racial wealth differential in the United States. And so we contend that that piece of legislation needs to be written in such a way that whatever commission is formed is actually charged with 3 objectives in the design of the proposals that they bring forward. And the first objective is to specify Black American descendants of US slavery as the eligible recipients. The second objective is to make a commitment that at minimum, the bill will be designed to eliminate racial wealth differences in the United States. And third, and finally, the bill must be designed, or the legislation that's proposed must be designed in such a way that direct payments are made to eligible recipients. And barring those 3 characteristics being built into the commission's charge, we think that the legislation is not satisfactory.
So, John, when we were working towards what became the successful passage of the Civil Liberties Act, there was a consideration about what would be enough, what would constitute acknowledgement, what would constitute, you talked about not wanting to include an apology because the repertory payments were important. In this environment, Kirsten and Sandy talk about in their book acknowledgement, redress, and closure. What are, between all three of you, what would constitute closure? What would constitute, is it Sandy achieving all those three objectives that you just mentioned?
Absolutely. In so many ways, the program of redress that JSL and others pushed for and succeeded in winning is the model, really, for how to go about this process. I mean, it perfectly incorporates ARC, as we fashion it, acknowledgement, redress, and closure. You had an educational component that made it clear that the United States had made a mistake, that it had acted unlawfully. People needed to know that, so that when we talk about this education process, both members of Congress were educated and the American people as a whole, both to what had occurred, what had happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, and the fact that the United States government admitted that it was wrong and that it needed to take steps to materially compensate those victims for those harms. So we're talking about, getting the record straight, and then making some material, some formal, both tangible and intangible gifts, basically, to the wronged, to the folks who were harmed, and saying, and in addition to saying, we're sorry, we did a terrible thing, and we know we can't make it up to you completely, but we're going to make an effort. We're going to make a good faith effort here. And then the idea of closure, from our perspective, is, the parties would agree eventually that the matter had been settled, that significant efforts had been made to acknowledge these harms and to them specifically in all of the things that we do, discrimination, education, employment. It's a tall order, but it is not an impossible one. And the idea is that once we have achieved this condition where the aggrieved say, yes, we are satisfied, then if there are no new atrocities, no new grievances brought to bear, or any reoccurrences of grievances that had occurred in the past, then Black American descendants of U.S. slavery would no longer bring forth racially based complaints against the U.S. government.
Just a moment. I just wanted to add that there's another important distinction between the Black American case and the Japanese American case, where I think in the Japanese American case, there's a clear evidence of the violation of the U.S. law. In the Black American case, for many, many years, it's the U.S. law that sanctioned the atrocities. And so that's another reason why we think we have to go to Congress rather than through the court system, because Congress has to acknowledge that the laws were wrong.
Yes, I felt that very powerfully in your book. But I want to go back to John on this question of closure, because I think I was among those in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Liberties Act and Senator Inoue and others achieving the budgetary entitlements so that the payments could actually be made, and my one grandmother and my parents, like, got to see them receive their checks. But I wonder if we had a false sense of security after that, because then things with 9/11 and Muslim travel ban and other issues have come up, and then all of these same false historical narratives resurfaced. And I was thinking, I thought, as Kirsten had just said, I thought we fought this fight and that we had gotten over that, but we didn't. John, you want to, and you've been very active with the post 9/11 ramifications. You want to say a few words?
Well, I do think we got closure, and a lot of it had to do with truth telling, with the ability of Japanese Americans to sit before an official body of the United States government, the commission, and talk about what that personal experience was like. That was extremely important. And that was the whole strategy of this commission. It wasn't for just this body doing an investigation. In my mind, we had to have the Nisei testify. I mean, it was kind of a risk strategy, because at that point, the Nisei refused to talk about this publicly. Yeah. But once we had those hearings, they needed to talk. You could just sense the relief in the community. And it was because there was this truth-telling element to it, that there was a kind of restorative justice that that wasn't exactly what we were trying to aim at, but that did happen for us, because it was the ability or the opportunity to expiate all this angst and the pain and the sense of our own tragedy, to talk about that. It released us from the repressive kind of burden we carried, the guilt about having been prisoners, all of that. It was very psychological for us. I think the fact that we did have that experience, that the Nisei finally got catharsis, contributed enormously 10 years later, 15 years later, after 9/11. And, I know the community was involved, but in the J cell, we had a concerted effort to try to do what we could to protect the Arab and Muslim communities, because we'd been through this. We knew what this was going to be. I think had we not had redress, we would not have been able to mobilize ourselves, the community, to go out there and fight for the rights of another group that was experiencing what we did right after Pearl Harbor. So, I think it was, in a way, it showed how we had been able to reconcile all the complexities of the psychological complexities of what we called camp, to be able to step outside of ourselves. And redress, I'm convinced, did that for us. That we got the money. The money didn't matter. The money was symbolic. I mean, $20,000 for 3 years imprisonment, but it was just symbolic. It was a way to make people sort of sit up and wonder what in the hell we were doing. And it was the message of that campaign that we would not allow this to happen again in the future, that we have the provisions in the Constitution, Bill of Rights, all that, to protect Americans. And I saw the response to 9/11 as such an expression of the determination that we had been saying all along, that we're not doing this for ourselves, we're doing it for the future. And then the future just smacked us in the face on 9/11, and we were able to respond. I think closure is really important, because it's what gives you, there's this whole thing about atonement. It's so important. And until you can achieve certain degrees of freedom, psychological freedom from everything that causes you so much grief, it's really difficult. And I know one of the questions you want to ask is, what advice would I give to those who are leading the Black Reparations campaign? I think it would be to try to find that moment. I think truth-telling became so important. And I think it will be important for the Black Reparations movement. And the only reason I say that now is that before I read Kirsten's and Sandy's book, I consider myself pretty well informed. And I thought I knew a lot about the Black experience. My God, after reading that book, I was stunned. I mean, it's so revealing about the pain and the horribleness of the Black experience in America. I don't think Americans really understand that. I think you need something like a commission to give you the opportunity for that moment, for Americans to watch television and hear these stories. I mean, I think every American ought to read your book, by the way. It's a great, what's the word? Expose of the horribleness of life in America if you're a Black person. I was stunned when I read it. I mean, it's an incredible telling of the story. So, I really appreciate your having published the book.
Hear, hear. So let me ask one last question, and then I'm seeing some questions starting to come in the chat that I think folks might want to have you collectively address. And that's what would you like our participants, our viewers today, if they were inclined to take some kind of action, what would you recommend we do? What would you like to see happen?
I think one of the most significant things that each of us can do individually and in groups is to advocate, lobby, and petition Congress for a reparations program for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. This can take the form of a letter, petition. In Durham, North Carolina, we know that the City Council unanimously passed a resolution in support of a national program of reparations. And significantly, it includes the three basic features that Sandy mentioned. It identifies the eligible recipients. It targets the elimination of the racial wealth gap as its goal. And it specifies the importance of having a significant part of a reparations portfolio include direct payments to those eligible recipients. But that's something that all of us can do. And I think one could do it through your formal and informal organizations to which you belong, whether that's your employer or your book club or your artisanal beer collective, your ultimate Frisbee group. There are any number of communities to which we belong where these conversations can take place.
So one of the questions I see in the chat that just came in, what are the structural reforms suggested to shrink the racial wealth gap after a potential reparations bill is passed?
So maybe I can best attempt to answer that by referring to a quotation that we really think is powerful and appropriate to this conversation. And it's a quotation from Malcolm X, where he describes a situation in which somebody has plunged a knife 9 inches into his back. And he makes a distinction between having the knife pulled out of his back and having the wound that was created by the stabbing healed. And so we think of reparations as a form of healing the wound, compensating for the damage. In the case of a knife attack, compensating for the damage that has been caused by the stabbing. But we also think it's vital that the knife be pulled out, that the harms or damages that have been taking place be stopped. And so if people are concerned about structural changes that have to accompany a reparations program, then I think that the focus should be on those kinds of harms and damages that are ongoing. and bringing them to an end. So that's the structural component from our perspective. We need both and, as Kirsten always says, we need to pull the knife out and we need to heal the wound. And reparations in the form of eliminating the racial wealth differential in the United States is healing the wound. But we do need to stop discrimination from taking place. We do need to stop the police from executing unarmed blacks, police lynchings. We do need to end mass incarceration. There is a growing abolitionist movement around incarceration, and that movement is one that needs to be activated. So it's a matter of simultaneously pulling the knife out and healing the wound.
And then there's some question or suggestion about, would that include not only financial payments, but for instance, grants for healthcare, education, small business grants, land ownership?
And certainly these could be, ancillary, supplemental programs, but they should not replace direct payments to the eligible recipients. When we look at, we talked about, the Japanese American case quite a bit, but it's also the case that, the Jews who were harmed in the Holocaust received direct payments, not only from the Republic of Germany, but also from the United States, which wasn't actually even a perpetrator of those harms. When you look at the 9/11 attacks, the special master deemed that direct payment should be made to the survivors and to the victims' families. This was also the case with the Sandy Hook, Connecticut horrible, massacres. There's a lot of deliberation on the front end there about what should be done, and in fact, quite a lot of money had been raised and given to local. I think the United Way was one of the operatives in that case, but also a number of other foundations. And the families were outraged. They felt that this was a travesty, that they should be allowed to decide what should happen with those funds. If they wanted to create a foundation in their children's names, some of them did do that, and that should be their prerogative. It shouldn't be forced upon them. And I think that is absolutely what should happen in the case with Black Americans. This is, just because we're talking about Black American sins of U.S. slavery, the rules shouldn't change. Direct payments is a time-honored way to address these harms, and we think it should be the method that's used in this case.
If individuals want to use the funds for the purposes of purchasing land or expanding an existing business or developing a new business, or if they want to use the funds for additional years of schooling beyond, beyond high school or beyond college and university for that matter, then that should be their choice to make. So we give them the resources and we let them make the decision about how the resources are to be used.
So their own flexibility.
Yeah, their own discretion. Yeah.
So there's
that's only right, because if it's reparations, once you pay an individual, the government should have no say in how that money should be spent. It's the individual's money. So however that person wants to spend it, that's his or her business. One interesting strategy we used with reparations, once it was clear money was forthcoming, was that rather than pay money out directly, the money went into a fund. It went into a fund of the Treasury under the authority of the Department of Justice, and it was administered from that fund, individual payments. And the advantage of that was that if you were alive when the bill passed and you died after the signing of the bill, it kept your eligibility. And so the money you would have received went to your heirs. We dropped the heirs clause because of the JLA issue, but we maintained it once the bill was passed, that the money would go into a fund from which the individual payments would be made. And there was a kind of psychological thing with the public as well, because the sense was, oh, well, it went into a fund. It didn't go straight from the president signing checks and sending them out to Kirsten and Sandy and all that. You know, it sort of softened in the public view what was happening with that money.
I wanted to ask a question about your comment about the amounts, you know, being small, and certainly $20,000 is not a grand amount of money, particularly given the nature of the atrocity. But on the other hand, if we think about what it would be worth today, it's somewhere in the vicinity of $60,000 to $80,000. And there are multiple members of the same family who were subjected to incarceration. So each one of them potentially would have received the payments. I think Susan, you mentioned that both of your parents as well as one of your grandparents received payments. So from the standpoint of a family's receipt of compensation, then it's larger than $20,000.
And it could be approaching, you know, $400,000 to $500,000 in today's dollars.
Yeah. So it's not enormous, but it's not trivial. Yeah.
But you know, the question for us was, what price do you put on freedom? How much is liberty worth? Whatever it is, it's symbolic. I was asked at a congressional hearing challenging why we were demanding 25,000, and was told, well, you know, if it's symbolic, why not make it $1 per person? And I said, well, if it's symbolic, but if you really want to get down to what I think the cost of liberty is, it should be $1 million a day per person. And then we're talking about true redress. But anything less than that would be symbolic. It's hard to work the equation out, but you know, I think what you describe in your book is really a wise approach to the idea of how much money and how you determine how you get there. Because there are various formulas you can use, but that has a lot of viability. It's a good argument.
So there's some questions that harken back to what we talked about a little earlier about in the redress campaign, there was JCL and there were other organizations, NCRR and CJAR. And then now within the Black reparations community, there's an assortment of different groups, and I'm understanding they have different approaches and philosophies. So one of the questions is, what are some ways that these groups might be able to get on the same page? Is there a way to have the groups work together so that they're not working at cross purposes or working in any kind of antagonistic way?
Well, I guess I'd love to hear a bit more from John about how those antagonisms were overcome in the Japanese American community.
You know, we each had our own thoughts about how best to do this, organizations. And I just kept, you know, I guess it's like the saying, kept my eye on the prize. I would adjust the goal, what we were trying to achieve, and how we could best achieve it. And I looked at the various options that we had, the mechanisms that would get us there. And it seemed to me this commission idea was the only really feasible way to achieve I mean, it was a large program, huge goals to educate the American public from coast to coast, all four corners, and then to convince them that we were not the bad guys, but we were the victims of racism at a time when we were in a trade war. So to me, it was a matter of finding the approach and I guess if I were to answer your question and as advice, find what you think is the best approach and the organization that could help lead that track that you're trying to get the movement on. Because if it has viability, You know, I can't speak to the current Congress. It's so crazy right now. But reasonable people in the Congress will see what is the most reasonable and the one that has the most viability and is an honest approach to what you're trying to achieve. They can sort it out. They will sort it. They have to be convinced, obviously. But it's a matter of survival. What will survive that rough trip through the Congress? And it's going to be challenged. Whatever the approach is going to be challenged. And many members will try to kill it. But if you have a good approach, one that other members of Congress can believe in, that's what will get you through. I mean, you almost can't listen to the chatter out there and the chaos that comes from it.
You know, I was gonna say, I was really encouraged to see how dramatically the approach that JA Cell, advocated changed over time. You know, as you said, no one wanted a commission. But
I didn't want a commission.
Exactly, exactly. And I think in your book you mentioned a gentleman who brought that idea to you. It wasn't something that I believe this is right, that it didn't come from the Japanese American community itself, right. And you just thought, no, this is not the way to go. But I think that's a lesson that needs to be learned, in this campaign, that the way you start out is not necessarily the way things end, but you want to, as you said, keep your eyes on the prize. The way we get there is various, and it's really difficult, if not impossible, to know who the linchpins are going to be. That was also really instructive. I mean, there were certainly, as you said, the four, members of the Japanese American community who were connected, through
Congress.
The two members, Norman Etta and Bob Matsui in the House, and then Senators Inoue and Matsunaga in the Senate. Yeah, those are the big four.
Huge. Yeah. And we have not seen our champions emerge in that way. Not consistently. And so, there's a lot, and that may not be the way this evolves. I don't know. But that, you stay connected to the cause, that you stay connected to the importance of breaking this apart. You weren't so focused on how that's going to happen, but that it had to occur. That to me was incredibly important.
It sounds like the one of the themes that emerges from the Japanese American redress effort is keeping your eyes on the ultimate prize and being flexible about how you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because without that flexibility, you're never going to make it. I mean, there will be efforts presented to you that you may reject and think this, it won't have a chance. But you just have to kind of, I mean, in my case, I really did not like the commission strategy. It seemed counter to everything we wanted to do. But if you examine it, the options, you'll figure out which is the best option that will achieve what you think needs to be achieved. And I think the three things you outline as the charge of a commission are really important. And I had been asked for years, decades, about Black reparations. And my answer always used to be, absolutely, it should happen. It needs to happen, but I don't know how it can. I just don't have an answer on that. I think as ironic as it might be that in the atmosphere of the most racist president we've ever had, that at this moment.
Second to Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, you're right. I stand corrected. I mean, we've had plenty, but
Andrew Johnson's the worst.
Oh, yeah.
having this
Well-
conversation if Andrew Johnson had not succeeded Abraham Lincoln.
We wouldn't have had Donald Trump as president probably if Abraham Lincoln hadn't been assassinated and Andrew Johnson become president. Yeah.
If we could do a 2-hour book talk about the worst presidents, and
Yeah.
there are two right there. But I mean, it's ironic that in the atmosphere today, Black reparations does seem possible. I've never thought before that it would be, but I think there are the doors there that are opening on this. And to me, it's a very reasonable campaign to try to run if you can get all the elements together. There's going to be a lot of disagreement. People are going to be at each other's throats. But if you can just keep moving forward and you know where you're trying to take it, you can't do any more than that.
So Kirsten and Sandy, from my volunteer redress perspective, my roots are in Orange County, California. My dad was very active in the Japanese American community. I grew up with his involvement in these community organizations, and then also with the synergy of activity that was taking place in the Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles area with the various redress organizations being based in Los Angeles, that in terms of people coming together and making a contribution, I saw that here on a local level, because we were keeping the eye on, as John described, on the ultimate prize, that transcended a lot of the organizational, at least on the local level here, it transcended a lot of that organizational strategic differences that someone here might have been a member of all those redress efforts. And because they recognize that the different organizations had different approaches. But when it came time there were certain commonalities when it came time for the letter writing and the messages into the members of Congress and the senators, and these action alerts about this is coming up, contact these people and tell them to please support HR 442 or the companion Senate bill. These were the action items that we all had in common. No matter what part of the no matter what the organizational goals or strategies or bickering or differences were, for those of us that were on the ground, it was get support for the bill, or get support the ISE, support the NISE in testifying at the commission hearings here in Los Angeles. And so I had a bit of both perspectives. One on the how to achieve this and support people like John on the national strategies, but it was also very much showing up at the monthly chapter meetings of JACL, or at little meetings that were taking place in Little Tokyo, and there was that commonality in terms of that community action. And so that's one of my fondest memories, actually, of working on the redress campaign.
Thank you for sharing that, Susan.
It's, any effort like this is by very nature going to be a grassroots effort.
Yeah.
And you cannot control the grassroots. They go where they want to go. And, sometimes it's not grass, it's weeds, but it works out if you just
let 1,000 flowers bloom.
I mean, if you all have the common goal, somehow it will sort itself out, but it needs that strong leadership. It needs somebody or some entity to point the direction, whether the community wants it or not, and say that this is the most viable way we will accomplish what we all seek. They may not agree with you, but as you move forward, sometimes inching forward, one by one, people start to realize, if nothing else, this is the only game in town and we have to support it.
there's still so much to talk about, and I see some wonderful comments and questions in, and it's just such a regret that we've already kept you all for an hour and a half. And so very regretfully, I think we should let Duncan close us. And before we do, I just want to say how much fun it's been to prepare for this, and how meaningful it's been for me to get to be a part of this conversation with Kirsten and Sandy and John, someone I've known and admired for so many years.
Thanks,
John is
Susan.
one of our heroes also.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Duncan,
you.
we'll let you close.
Okay, well, thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. I think we got a little glimpse into what truth-telling could be, what, taking out that knife and healing from it could be, even from this small snippet of conversation. And so I hope everyone out there, if you have the resources to buy these books, please do. This is Sandy and Kirsten's book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, and John Tateishi's book, Redress, The Inside Story, the Successful Campaign for Japanese American Reparations. These two books are featured in our book club, and so we'll get a chance to hopefully come back, read them, and have further discussions. The book clubs are organized where we'll have some initial framing, but then we get into breakout rooms and can have small group discussion of many of the finer points that come up in these two really wonderful books. So thank you for all of you who participated in this session. There's, I think, over 300 people who took time out of their afternoon to join us today. But of course, thank you to Susan for moderating, and of course to John, Kirsten, and Sandy for really helping us kick off this conversation series. I really appreciate it. Thank you on behalf of the Ito Center and our partner organizations, Densho, Japanese American National Museum, and Tsurufu Solidarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.